Okay, we are getting pretty far along now, and we last discussed influence versus authority, and now we're going to move into politics, office politics specifically. And again, this is like interviewing a topic that you could spend a book or a lifetime studying, mastering, and whatever. But for purposes of this series, I'm going to give you sort of the first coat of paint. And I don't know what's written on this topic. Um, I mean, I have some reference materials that I could probably dig up, but I don't have like a deep library of this. This is mostly born out of personal experiences. So, um, so, any group activity involving humans has some political element to it, unless there's incredibly rigorous structures to attempt to prevent that. Like, courtrooms are supposed to be engineered to, take the political element out of it. And what do I mean by politics? Well, it means that everybody's got their biases and their positions and their, groups that they're affiliated with, right? And you can try to let the facts, win any given situation, or you can try to influence things. Um, and the politics I'm going to talk about even extends beyond that, right? It's basically uh, you know, using persuasion and conversations and social goodwill and compelling arguments and all that other stuff to get what you want. And get what you want can be completely selfish, lobbying for a corner office or a promotion or something, or it can be genuinely in the interests, in your opinion, of the organization at large, your organization specifically, or so on. And the reason this is related to, sort of influence versus authority, these are cousins here. Politicking is, exercising influence. It's trying to persuade people that your position on some topic is right and that your opinion should weigh sort of disproportionately, or that the opinion of a group should weigh disproportionately above, whatever, the simple facts are, what have you. So every organization has its power structures, right? And there's the explicit legible ones, which is the org chart and what have you. And there's the informal power structures that exists in form of sort of relationships and experience and so on and so forth. So, for example, people that know Hugh from way, way back, I think that Hugh was not really aware of giving, his posse special treatment, but he definitely felt more at ease with certain people. And, it was a real double-edged sword. He offered me, of course, lots of opportunities to make mistakes and so on and so forth that other people wouldn't have been afforded, right? So, when at PacBio, I had a really, really bad day and mouthed off and whatever. A story I've told a bunch of times, no doubt. Hugh told me point blank, if you were anybody else, I would have had to fire you because, you challenged my authority. But he made a political calculation that it was better for the organization to, make an exception. And the reason that exception was going to be palatable because everybody knew that Hugh and I were buddies. And, that's not the best example, but it is an example of what happens when, if decisions were made purely based on, merit or whatever, right? If there were just rules and either you followed the rules and you didn't, I would have been fired because, the rule in that situation is you have a line manager shooting their mouth off. You gotta, you know, in the interests of fairness or whatever, you gotta let him go. And when you find yourself in a position that you have some ability to influence the org, and you can do that as an IC, but of course the higher you go, the more formal authority you have, it tends to sort of bolster your influence. They reinforce each other. And so that's a situation, a series of situations, an ongoing series of situations that it's good to know how to navigate. And again, I can't go incredibly deep on this topic exactly. I can, speak to some examples and we can walk through the outline here. One of the ways I think about, the exercise of this sort of influence on an organization is you can be political or you can be unimpeachable. And of course, it's not a binary, it's a spectrum, right? Like, where do you want to be on that spectrum? And actually, they're kind of like, it's kind of like orthogonal vectors. You can kind of be both. But, political means that you're willing to, exercise authority and influence, maybe beyond the strict scope of your job, right? So, for example, at PacBio, there were multiple people who I thought were not good for the company. There was a VP of operations, and there were two people that VP had hired. There was a head of IT and a head of program management. And I thought all three of them were incompetent. And so I took a, political stance. It wasn't my job to have them removed. Like, they did not report to me. They were nowhere near my organization. That was a whole other branch of the thing. Is it in my purview at all to say something about it? Well, I chose to make it so, right? Because I genuinely thought that, having these people in the positions that they were in was bad for the company. So I, just waltzed into Hugh's office. Again, I had the wherewithal to do this. I had a little bit of safety around this because, again, buddies with the CEO, right? And those relationships don't have to go back decades, right? Like, once you sort of establish social capital with other people and you start to sort of, gather the ability to, take positions that are credible, then you can make arguments that, change needs to happen. And, you're not going to walk into somebody's office and say, you need to fire so-and-so, but that's basically what I did. But the way I did it was, hey, you should, pay very, very close attention to these people that, may not necessarily report direct to you, right? Like, when I went after, for example, the head of program management, she was awful. And I'm like, I gave some examples of like, okay, so-and-so is not getting it done and doesn't really know what's going on and looks good and speaks well and has really beautiful slides and is just like an empty windbag in a lot of ways. And that was enough. And what I did was because the two people that reported to this VP that I thought were incompetent, I took them out first, right? I was establishing a pattern where the reason I thought the VP was no good was because the people that he was populating his org with, or at least the people he was putting into leadership positions in his org, were not skillful. So I took them out first by saying, hey, Hugh, you should really pay close attention to these people that, don't directly report to you, but have substantial influence in the company, have decision-making authority on things that are important for us. So, so I chose like a pretty political route. Another way to have, and that involves like directly trying to influence people, asking for favors, calling things into question, digging up dirt, right? Finding out, like, you see them in a meeting that Hugh's not in it and they do something stupid or whatever, you write it down and you take it to, the person that can ultimately affect change and say, did you know, right? And yeah, it's kind of shitty and it's kind of tattletale and it's a little bit, it can look like it's, grade school, playground bullying, but like, you're going to get judged on whether or not ultimately, you were right. Like, if you cry wolf a bunch, right? If you lack credibility, if you lack influence, nothing's really going to happen, right? One of the reasons you accumulate influence and credibility and all that stuff is that sometimes you need to use it, right? Sometimes you're right about stuff and you won't always be right. And it's okay to be wrong from time to time. But if you see something going down and it's just, and it can be petty, right? Like it can be just like someone you just genuinely don't like. You can take a bunch of facts and skew them in a way that you just, somebody you don't like gets taken out. I don't do that. But it's certainly a thing that people can do. And then there's all sorts of people who will, play politics from the standpoint of like, they feel like they're competing with somebody, right? And if they're like either, digging up real dirt or they're fabricating dirt or whatever to hurt somebody else's career, they can do that from a completely selfish perspective. I don't advocate that, but I mean, you need to know how it works by and large. Um, so the unimpeachable end of it is if, you always toe the line, if you always follow the rules or whatever, then you're in a much stronger sort of moral / ethical position to call out other people when they don't. Now, that's a little bit of a joke too, because, what does unimpeachable means? It means that, you have extremely high credibility, you have extremely high trustworthiness, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean you have to mind your own business. So being able to influence the org through sort of, there's sort of highly political means, maybe sort of the dirty tricks end of the spectrum, and unimpeachable is like, no one will ever question your motives, even if they are not 100% up and up. They need to be at least plausibly on the up and up, that you're doing it, for the right reasons. Like if you're gonna try to influence some aspect of the org, you're not doing it if, purely selfishly, because that can backfire. Now, we know that some people get ahead by stepping on the heads of others, by taking credit for other people's work, by, only talking shit about them and never mentioning the good things that they do and whatever. And that's, that's kind of the shady end of politics, but it's all part of the same spectrum. So I've got a couple of, I mentioned briefly here, point D, Hugh, as a concrete example, overemphasizes relationships, right? So is that good or bad? Well, it's kind of both, right? Like the fact that people walked into Lacuna, and some of them picked up on the fact that there were sort of Hughes chosen, right, that had a lot more leeway to screw up than others. That can be really uncomfortable. I'm sure more than one person left because they're like, oh, well, I haven't known Hugh for 20 years, so I'm never going to get ahead here. And I don't think that was overt. I think that was sort of a sense that they developed. I don't think it was necessarily true. Like anybody that comes in and performs, Hugh will elevate and reward, and you don't have to have been his buddy for a long time. But the other hand, the fact that that's perceivable, right? Like you'd love to have sort of a, platonically fair organization where it doesn't matter if you've been there for a long time or not. That like if you perform, if you produce, if you do what you're asked to do and then some, doesn't matter. And we all know that like people's comfort levels for, especially when it comes to promotion, right? And I go back to something we've talked about a fair amount, which is people are really risk averse when it comes to promotions and such, because the higher you go up the food chain, the more opportunity there is for damage. And so before they're going to give you more authority, they want to be damn sure you're not going to use it to fuck things up. Now, they don't care by and large if you're political or not. That's a question of sort of like just raw competence. But people that are sort of looking to move up in whatever organization they're in, are, of course, they're going to try to influence that. They're going to try to influence it by, being good at their jobs, but they're also going to try to influence it by saying, hey, look at me, I really should be at this next level and whatever. And, to some extent, that's diffused by having really good job titles and role descriptions and leveling and all that stuff. Like it's pretty, and when you have all that stuff firmly in place, it's a lot easier to decide. But Lacuna had a vice president of product who just really, really wanted to be the vice president of product, even though he wasn't ready for it. And this is another example that I'm not like super proud of exactly, because the individual in question is someone I really like, is a decent human being. I've been to his house, he's been to my ranch. But when it was clear that he wasn't getting it done, I stuck the knife in that guy's back. I made an extremely detailed and no punches pulled sort of readout to our fearless leader on why this person wasn't getting it done, right? And Hugh made a mistake. Hugh made a relationship mistake because this person in question had done a lot of hard work, had busted his butt in the previous context, and was a nice, decent human being. And Hugh, based on all that stuff, gave him a chance without really evaluating, is the guy ready? And it's clearly wasn't. And it unfortunately it kind of lingered for too long, in my opinion. So is it a good thing or a bad thing that Hugh overemphasizes relationships? Well, yes. Going back to that concept of the double-edged sword. The good news is that he's got a posse of people who generally like to work together, and he's usually adding to it. It's rare that somebody is like, yeah, I don't want any part of this, and they walk. When Hugh walks into a new environment, he comes with, a lot of potential team people, right? Like, Lacuna in particular, right? Like, who was going to be his first engineering hire? Well, who was going to just have like the requisite skills, had done this before, was ready to sort of drop everything and, come run off to build, Salita's crazy thing in Los Angeles. Well, hello, and it was a bunch of us. It wasn't just me, there were lots of people that came over for better, for worse. So, his strengths are his weaknesses. And that's true for a lot of us. You just have to be cognizant of that stuff. You need to be self-aware about it. And you need to be aware of what your, manager, your chain of command's tendencies are. Like, I think Don is way less like that. Like, Don is just very by the book, cold hard facts, he doesn't have like his people. Like, we're all his people, but none of us are really that close to him either, is my read. But Hugh also, overshares information, right? And he uses that to keep people in the loop in a way that they feel like they have some idea what's going on. Generally, he doesn't always. We saw a lot of that, as Lacuna was on its way down. There's a fair amount of like half truths. Sounds terrible, but they were half truths. Oh, we have money through October. Well, if he left off the if everything goes right, or whatever. But that oversharing of information can be a good thing, or it can be a bad thing. Like the first time I went in and told him that this, this VP at PacBio, in my opinion, wasn't getting it done, he just kind of stared at me incredulously and says, wow, really, you're a first-time line manager and you're looking to take out a VP, really? So he like gets on the PA, or not the PA, but this intercom, and says, Barb, his faithful assistant, Barb, Marie here needs, has some opinions about how so-and-so's doing his job. You should set up a one-on-one for them. And I was just like, I cannot believe that this information that I brought to you in confidence is now like, Barb knows, okay, maybe that's okay. But now like, you're like going to go and put me in front of the person that has vastly more organizational power than I do, a different organization, but whatever, within the company. The dude's a vice president. And you're going to like, I'm supposed to go in there and give him a piece of my mind. Holy shit, was that uncomfortable. And I, when I eventually got into that person's office and sat there, and I was like, well, I don't know what Hugh told you, and kind of like hemmed and hawed and tried not to be overt about, where I was coming from. I tried to give, a little bit of constructive feedback in the gentlest way possible, but mostly I was just looking to get out of there with my, legs not broken. So, and, there's been times when, Hugh's given out information to people and they've just turned around and told other people like outside the company. And there was a VP at PacBio that got his ass fired because he basically told a guy who can't keep his mouth shut, okay, you definitely can't tell this one thing to that one person. And the guy just went out and did it, boom, done. And like, in the end, it didn't hurt us all that much, but like, it was information that Hugh could have kept under wraps, to protect, but, he was excited to share progress and make people feel invested and so on and so forth. So, the way you manage your relationships is part of politics. The way you share information is part of politics, because information is power, right? If you are hoarding, some piece of information, you better be thoughtful if it really has value to other people, did you get something in return for it? Now you can get just social capital. That's the way I worked for the longest time. I would tell people, kind of whatever I knew. And if you do that too much, you look like an idiot because it looks like you're just giving shit away for free. And people are like, oh, I never have to give this person anything. They'll just come into my office and tell me, whatever it is they know, and like that being that sort of awareness of like using your information as power, I think is something you have to be, thoughtful about. And yeah, you can totally share information with your pals and whatever, but like if you're going to play the game, you should be giving a fair amount of thought as to, who you tell what. So, I have this statement here. There are many other axes of culture. Some are unsustainable once the company gets to a certain size. So when, company's 20 people, everybody basically knows everybody. Everybody can kind of, hang out and get to know each other really well. And the divisions between organizations, engineering versus product, well, you're all in the same, close proximity all the time. You're probably all having lunch together anyway. So information tends to flow freely, relationships get developed, and so on and so forth. And what happens is, the bigger and bigger you get, the less that's going to be true, right? There's that, I don't know, I forget who, I think it was an anthropologist, came up with some number. It was like 150. 150 is about as many like sort of distinct individuals as you can hold in your head at once. And I don't know if that's like globally or if that's like, sort of context dependent or whatever. But the point is that like, once organizations start to grow, and most companies are larger than 10 or 20 people, the ability for everybody to sort of like know each other, trust each other, understand each other, falls off. Like there's always going to be people in that 1,000-person company. You walk past them in the hall every day, you don't know what their name is, you don't know what their job is, right? So this, the ability to sort of affect them, judge them, evaluate them, manipulate them, falls off. And now you're looking at sort of, structural changes that if you like, oh, well, this group is screwing up, you might be able to identify one or two individuals, but you probably don't have time for it. So that's where, you're going to have to influence, people in leadership positions that you do know, and you want to cultivate relationships with the leadership in those organizations once you're in a leadership role. So a lot of those informal networks start to break down, and they become more sort of formal networks. You rely a little bit more on org charts and so on and so forth. I already said, information is currency and power. That's, I hope that's more or less self-evident, and that's a topic you could talk about for a long time, managing it, how to decide when to share and when to, trade and whenever, but also how to, sort of convey in coded language with people that something, but you're not going to just give it away. And like this, the sort of the dance of, yeah, I might be able to help you, but what have you got for me? If you say it in a really transactional fashion like that, you just look like kind of a chump, I think, in most contexts, right? That sort of the coded language of, the executive, or as I like to put it, the sociopath. If you don't sort of speak that language, then people are going to know that you're the chump at the poker table, right? So the teaching of, what my friend Venkat calls power talk is way beyond the scope of this, but just be aware that, power talk is a thing. The, sort of coded transmission of, the fact that you might know something, the fact that you might be willing to sort of trade that for something, whether the trade is other information or a favor or something else, all of that, it sort of plausibly deniable negotiating is a skill that takes forever to master. And I'm going to say that it's beyond the subject of, your first line manager job, but just be aware that that's a thing. And that when you see people talking at, the V and the C level, that a lot of times the messages are coded in various ways that are probably going to be tricky to parse. So, whether or not you're sort of an overtly political animal or not, you're going to want to cultivate trust. Trust that you're not an idiot, first and foremost. I guess that's more sort of on the credibility end of things, right? For example, if you do some sort of exchange of information or whatever, if somebody has given up information, it might need to be like really constrained because they might be identifiable as the source of that information. So you need to be thoughtful about You know, if you're going to act on some sort of information, you have to be indirect about it. You can't just go around saying, hey, I know this thing about this group or about this fuck up or about this whatever. That you want to be, you know, discreet. And then obviously we've talked about discretion and trust and credibility all over the place. But um, for being political, you know, trust is important, even if you're like a backstabber, right? You know, you have to like have a sort of credibility that if people think that you are skilled at playing the game, they might be more willing to play it with you and bring you into their, um, little informal power structures, right? Um, and that's, how a lot of these sort of, inside the company networks, especially among leadership, are built, is those exchanges of favors, those late night drinking sessions, those, that really bad thing that happened in Vegas that we're just never going to talk about again because it's mutually assured destruction, whatever it is. And, then there's this question of like, well, if you see something that you think needs to change, whether it's purely selfish reasons or not, there's the question of like, okay, so I'm going to take out that person, or I'm going to, damage their career or whatever. How do you decide like whether or not to move forward? Well, that's a whole, massive can of worms unto its own. But basically, if you're the gambling type, right, you might be willing to take some big risks, knowing that, if it all blows up in your face, you just quit and go someplace else. If you're a really good interviewer and in a strong job market, or both, right? Like you can place some risky bets to try to get into the V level or the C level if you think you're ready for it. Now, placing those bets is stupid if you're not ready for it, because people will be able to know if you're ready for it or not. Broadly by sort of feeling you out during an interview process. Or, figuring it out shortly after you land. You might just find yourself in the same sort of, roughly the same sort of power situation, but you're having to start over on certain axes and dimensions or whatever. So it's a very sort of personalized decision. I've only made those calls when I really felt strongly that someone was bad for the org. And as a result, my stock was at risk. The C-level stock was all at risk. The investor stock was at risk because somebody's not getting it done. And that person was like, if, somebody's in a position where it doesn't really matter, like, why would you bother, except like you're a sadist or a sicko. But if it's like, the VP of operations, and you think that person is, doing a shit job and you're worried about it, then, you might take a risky move or whatever. Or if you're just conservative and you don't think it's going to matter that much and you really don't want to stick your neck out, then don't. Okay. That's a very, very thin coat of paint on that topic, but happy to talk about that at some length. So if you decide you're going to take someone out, like I have multiple times in PacBio, Hugh's nickname for me at PacBio was the Assassin, because I had so many people removed over my tenure. Again, I didn't fire anybody, not directly. I would always just like have people in authority, observe closely when I thought somebody was, being awful. And I didn't always win. There were people that I couldn't stand, or that I, and that was a less likely plan in the first place. That occasionally I would try to get somebody removed because I just didn't like them. I think that only happened like once, and I just failed completely because the person ultimately was competent enough to do their job and would be hard to replace. I'm not going to name that name. But so the process of, undermining somebody is, potentially, really complicated, right? Like you can try sort of the overt method of getting their chain of command involved, but that's tricky, right? Like not everybody can just waltz into the CEO's office and, jump the chain of command, because now you're putting your whole chain of command like on alert that like that's a thing that you would do. And most people don't like it when their direct reports go over their head. Certainly at O&I Systems, I had like 5 layers of management between me and Hugh. And I would just walk into Hugh's office all the time because everybody knew I was kind of untouchable, right? And it made every single one of those people nervous. What the fuck is Marie in there saying? um, and I was only there for 3 years, and I was I was still an individual contributor, and I had a lot more leeway. Like, what were they going to do to me? They weren't going to bust me down to back to IC. I was still there. Um, so I would say that in the same way that you attempt to influence any other situation, which is you stick to the 90-degree angles. In other words, you might talk to your peers. You're probably not going to talk to your direct reports, but you're going to talk to your chain of command. Because really what you'd love to do is, in the case of, say, taking out a VP, like the smarter thing might have been, to try to make a case to my boss up the chain of command to somebody that was, so-and-so's peer, or someone that reported directly to Hugh, to persuade them that, this is a change that needed to happen. But, there were people that were, like the IT director and the program management director. Like, how was I even going to get to them? And in that case, I just, I went straight to the top and shot my mouth off about it. It wasn't subtle, but it was effective. Now, if I were engaged in doing something like that now, like when I went to Zipcar, I had a bunch of people removed, right? And some of them reported to me and some of them didn't. And some of them were ICs and some of them were managers and some of them were directors. And, basically that was an example of, where I had enough sort of credibility with the VP of engineering that I had gone around and I'd started with when I started at Zipcar trying to influence this, Boston office of like 200-300 people from the other side of the country. I started by building my list of, who was like smart and got things done. And it turns out that set was pretty small. And that's where I started, because I needed to be able to influence them to sort of get them on board with this gigantic replatforming project that at first most people didn't have much appetite for, because there was the whole ongoing set of designs and discussions for like, reforming the thing that they had rather than just throwing it out, which is in the end what happened. But after I had that list, at some point I went back and made another list, which are who are the people that like basically accomplish nothing? Who are the people that are just freaking dead weight? Who are the ones on the team of 6 who just sit in like kibitz? And not everybody has to check in code all day, every day. There's, other ways to contribute, but who are the people that are clearly just freeloading, right? And, my smart and get things done list was only about 10, but my useless people list was like 27, and when they had to do layoffs, like, I don't know if the VP came to me first, but he knew that I had a list because he came to me and he said, so I hear you have a list, right? I was ready to go with that list. And sure enough, like we had 22 layoffs and all but 1 or 2 of them came from my list. Now, was it my list, or was it like any reasonable engineering manager would have reached the same conclusions? I don't know, right? Like, did anybody else have a list like that? Would, in the absence of my existence in the company, would, the directors have come up with the same list of useless people? Probably. I mean, it's not like I have any like magical insights or whatever, but I don't know that anybody else had compiled that list. I don't know that anybody had that list sort of like ready to go and had really given a lot of thought to it. And the fact that I had been sort of really, investing some time in it, and I genuinely felt it was for the health of the organization, even though some of the people that I were on my list were really nice people. If you're trying to foster health in the organization, or at least trying to minimize harm when you have to do layoffs, right? Which is, in this case, that the orders came down from our, corporate overlords, Avis, you got to cut. Whatever, the results are still the same, is that the people that I wanted gone, by and large, were the people that were gone. And, I wouldn't say it felt good, but it was also kind of a relief to have, less deadwood basically collecting a salary in a low margin, let's be honest, a typical business to make a buck in. And the farther you go up the leadership chain, the more kind of ruthless you have to be, and the more you represent capital, and the less, you represent labor, even though you are still labor. Not to like, get crazy with bringing Marx into it. But those are, genuine considerations. You are being asked, once you take that step into management, to advocate for the business, which means you are advocating for capital, not labor. And that's something you kind of have to make peace with. And you can rationalize it. Oh, well, those people, weren't really doing anything here anyway. Hopefully they can go find something else that they'll feel better about themselves, or maybe they'll make more money someplace, whatever. Those are largely rationalizations that just, or to make it so that you don't feel like you're, a supervillain unless you're really into that sort of thing. So, I would, when you are going to try to have, and so this is an example of like, I worked through channels to, by and large, to, get the people on the layoff list on the layoff list. And I worked along the chain of command to get most of the people removed at PacBio that I had removed. And, I only had to do it once at Lacuna, the aforementioned VP of product. But that was another example of, I used my credibility and I made a persuasive argument and to the CEO, and, that person was let go. And I still feel kind of shitty about it, and still kind of feel like it was the right thing to do. All right, that's 40 minutes of rambling about politics. I probably should have paused for questions along the way. I don't know what to do with this. Is a little bit of an orphan. I'm gonna take that and put it in the unfiltered or the unfiled bucket. Another anecdote I want to tell someday, but questions, comments. I realize that it's a stupidly complicated topic, and again, one thin coat of paint on it to get you thinking about it. So
I had a question. What does overemphasizing relationships mean?
Well, it means that your credibility with somebody, your opportunities for promotions, the extent to which you are listened to, can be a function of like how long have you know somebody, or how well you get along with somebody, rather than sort of objective, the quality of what they say or how they do their job, right? So if you had, say, two people in, I'm not getting specific here, but like two people in customer service, and one of them is clearly more competent, but they're kind of abrasive and they're not, as likable. And you've all got someone else in customer success that like, they're not actually that great at their job, but like you really like them, you like having them around, they're kind of more fun to, whatever. Which one are you, if you had to cut one of them, which one are you going to cut? Right? Or if you had to promote one of them, which one are you going to promote? Are you going to promote the person that is better at their job? Or are you going to promote the person that you like more, the person that you've been working with longer? Right? So that's,
You should promote the person better at the job, right? But sometimes people don't do that.
And do you think that that is always what happens? We know that that is often not the thing that happens. That the people that get promoted are good talkers.
I never had a problem in Lacuna, so I cannot really comment on that. But I had seen that in a couple of other places where the people who were like, "Oh, look at me, I'm so great at my job," and that, but where push came to shove, they had really bad feedback, but all the official feedback was good. But the people who actually worked with them knew that they didn't do any work.
Yep.
It
is a thing that happens all the time. Yeah. And this is where there's a dotted line here to, sort of managing up versus managing laterally versus managing down. It doesn't matter all that much how well you manage down when it comes to promotion time. It really manages. It's really much more of a function of how you manage up. If your boss loves you, that's going to be the most important thing. If your boss trusts you, that's the most important thing. and that the credibility with your peers, yeah, I mean, if as long as they don't hate your guts and they're not trying to undermine you, and even then, if you're just really good at managing your boss, you know, and hyper focusing on the things that your boss wants you to do. Now, there's limits to that, right? Like if you have a bunch of people that report to you and you all you do is, suck up to your boss all day long and neglect the people underneath you, then they're going to leave or complain or be unproductive. And that can only be sort of hidden for a certain period of time, especially when you get turnover, right? Especially when that turnover leads to missed deadlines and low quality and things like that. Like there's only so much you can sort of paper over that. But there's an awful lot of like, situations where you can sort of put lipstick on a pig long enough to get that promotion and then they're never going to undo it, or it's highly unlikely that they will undo it because it'll make them look bad. Like, oh, well, if a promotion goes badly, it's as much on the person who signed off on the promotion as it is on the person that got promoted, right? Because ultimately, you're looking at the person with more, the more title you have, the more responsibility you have, the more likely you're going to get, beaten down for a bad choice. Like when a kid fucks up, do you get mad at the kid or do you get mad at the parent, right? And we're not children and parents here, but like, you know what I mean? That's sort of, there are levels of responsibility. And, you can also engineer situations where like everything sort of superficially looks really good. You run out and interview for another role and you get a title bump with that move and you leave a giant pile of shit behind you. All right. People get away with that all the time. You hope that they don't, but they do. So, any other questions, comments?
Nope.
All right. Well, I think that was a lot of material. And I also think that the next chapter is big enough that I can't fit it in 12 minutes. So I'm going to say that this is a good stopping place for today, and we will pick this up again Tuesday.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I hope that was a lot of useful food for thought.
It was. I just have like a confusion where certain things are like, but I've always been on the shit side of the politics. I've never been on the part where I play the politics. So,
yep.
I have to learn.
Well, I mean, you just got your first leadership role. So you were always going to be on the shit end of the politics. And
yeah,
you will continue to be until you get further up that chain.
yes.